Hey guys, Quiv the Lazy Geek here, and today we're gonna adjust the backlash on my AZEQ5 GT mount. Actually, I've already adjusted the backlash. I'm not actually really going to do it, but I'm going to show you how to do it because it is quite simple in the end. I'm going to show you how to adjust the backlash for the declination axis, which means the cover that is here. For the RA axis, we'd be removing the cover that is here. The procedure is basically the same. The only difference is how the cover is connected to the actual mount, but you know, it's very much the same, and I'll be mentioning a bit of the differences. So what do we need for that? We need Phillips screwdrivers, and we need some Allen wrenches. I don't remember the exact sizes of the Allen wrenches. I think it was something like 2 and 3 millimeters, if I remember correctly. We'll double check while we're doing it. Okay, so let's zoom into this, and hopefully this will be a short video because it is not a super complicated topic. And okay, so we're starting, and this particular cover that controls the the declination axis motor and stuff like that, it has 3 screws only. So we're gonna just take a Phillips screwdriver and remove those 3 screws. They have a different size depending on where the screw is located. For the other axis, for the RA axis, there are 4 screws there, but you know, it's like just a very small difference. So I have 2 on the side and 1 at the top, or 1 in the center at the top. Okay, so 1 screw. Two screws, 3 screws. Now I'm gonna remove the axis connector. Actually, I might even keep it, but the 3rd screw, yeah, I'll remove the connector. Okay, and the 3rd screw, I'll leave it fall out. Now, when you open up the cover like here, you have it connected. Like there is this the declination axis like cable thingy is connected to this board via this pin there. Now ideally you would want to remove that little white pin there, so you can just work on what you're going to do without the cover. That being said, I never was able to remove that thing like without feeling like I'm pulling some cables, and without feeling like really bad about myself. And because the cover is just so light, I just let it hanging there like that. It's probably not the best thing ever, but it doesn't actually put any tension on the cables, so meh, I don't really care. On the RA axis, you actually have 3 things that are connected to the cover. You have the motor, you have an encoder that's on the worm wheel. That's a very small thing that goes from the worm wheel to the board inside the cover. And it's a very small white connector. You can just pull on it and it just gets off immediately. And then there's a second one that goes from the board to here, where there's a second encoder. Again, a very small white connector. Pull it, remove it, and it's fine. Once done, you'll be like on the RA axis, you'd be removing those 2 screws, removing the motor, which we're gonna do right now. And once that's done, you can actually take off the cover along with the motor and put it aside. So that works quite well. Okay, now is the turn to get our Allen wrenches out and remove the motor, because we need to remove the motor to have access to screws that are kind of like hidden from us in between the motor and the worm. So we have the worm here, we have the worm gear is actually right under this worm, and we have the belt drive here, and we can just touch a little bit the belt drive to remember the tension on both sides, just in case. But then, like, don't worry too much about the tension, because the way that it's done, it's actually pretty well done. There is a little bolt, and we'll see it in the center here, that basically adjusts the tension of the belt. So as long as you don't touch that bolt, you'll end up roughly with the same tension. So okay, let's remove this motor. So I was right, this is the 3mm Allen wrench, and we're just going to unscrew this. Okay, there are little cute small tiny washers, so you want to make sure to get them as well. Okay, once I have loosened the motor, I can actually like wiggle it out, take the belt out, and just get the motor off. Now the motor is heavy, so we ideally want to disconnect it. But again, I had the same issue that I couldn't disconnect it. So what I did is I just left it here for the moment and just removed it once I needed to do what I needed to do. So we'll get to that in a moment. So the first thing is I have my axis locked right now, and I am able to turn this wheel, and you can see it actually turns the declination axis. There are several things we're going to do. The first thing we're going to do is behind the motor there are those 4 black screws here, and you'd want to like unfasten them and loosen them a tiny bit, a tiny little cute bit each, just so that you'll be able to actually move the motor assembly, the worm assembly, sorry, that's here, using this screw here at the center and those 2 screws here. So now if I take my 2mm Allen wrench, you can see that I actually have access to the screws, to like some grub screws that are within the motor. And it's not super clear on this video, but you can actually look in between this white base and the silver kind of motor worm assembly there. You can see the 3 screws, and the way that they work is, so we have the worm here, we have the gear underneath, and if you basically tighten the black, so the black screw here is actually pulling on the white base here. So the more I screw in this black screw, the tighter the worm will be against the wheel that's underneath. And then the 2 grub screws here are actually pushing against the white base here. So that means that what I would do is I would untighten, like loosen a little bit those 2 screws, like a tiny bit, and we're really talking about like 1/16 of a turn, something like that, and then tightening the main one, the main black one, to basically make the worm and the gear more meshed together. And you do that while those 4 screws here are slightly slightly, how do I say it, loosened. So what I do is I typically just like have the motor like that after I've loosened the screws, because I can just like leave it be, and then I play with this while moving the declination axis using my hand like this to see like what the tension will be and whether the motor will be able to drive it. Now you want to find the right compromise of no play on the RA axis and no play in the declination axis, and whether the motor actually binds. And for that, it's actually better to have something loaded on the declination axis. I'll start with just a dovetail. So right now I'll just put something as stupid as this, and I can just like take the end and, you know, try to jiggle the end, and then I'll see like how much backlash I have. Now there's one thing that I noticed on this mount, especially for the RA axis for me, when trying to move like the counterweight shaft side by side, there's still a little bit of wiggle. And I wasn't sure whether it was me not adjusting the axis properly and the screws properly. So what I did is I actually changed the screws so that they would be completely binding with the worm gear, so that there would be really no space for the axis to move in RA. And there was still a bit of that wobbliness or squishiness there. And I believe it's simply like you have the wheel that's around the shaft, and there's some slight space in between the shaft and the wheel, and that is moving left and right. I believe that's what's left, or maybe it's the worm wheel that is slightly moving left and right. So this is not something we'll be able to adjust. If you have a solution to that, please let me know down there in the comments. Okay, so what we're doing, so we've loosened those 4 bolts a tiny bit. We are playing by basically using the push screws, the push grub screws, and the pull screw in the center. Now, one thing as well is that you want to double check from time to time. Like here, you can actually see how well aligned the motor assembly, the worm assembly, is to the actual gear. And because you have 2 grub screws, one on each side, if you were like to push a lot on one and not on the other, then you'd be like inclined, asymmetrical. So your worm assembly would be kind of like on the side, which you want to avoid, having such a slanted motor assembly. So it is pretty delicate, so you always want to like look at the actual worm wheel, worm gear at the same time, see how far you are. And so you loosened a tiny bit those 2 grub screws, then you tighten this one, you check whether you can still move it by hand while you check like this. And basically you want to find a point where you can still move this by hand, but you do not have play in the axis anymore. And you don't want to tighten it too much, and you don't want to tighten it too little either, to be able to just remove the play. Now remember, there's that baseline kind of wiggle that I see at least on the RA axis, so that's something to keep in mind. Once I'm done, actually what I did is, rather than just reassemble everything immediately, I would of course tighten those 4 screws again. Now when you're tightening those screws, it can actually move the worm assembly a little bit. So I made sure that I had both the pull screw and the 2 push screws fairly well tightened, not like crazily tightened, because you can just like break the screws like that. You don't want to do that, but well in place, a bit like an SCD collimation, so that the worm assembly wouldn't wiggle once I tightened those 4 screws here. So once you're done, you would tighten those 4 screws like a little bit, one at a time, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you keep tightening them one at a time, a little bit, until they're all fully tightened. A bit like what we did with the EQ6R in a previous video. And you want to tighten them very well. You want to make sure that the worm assembly is very fixed and very stable. And then what I did for this particular axis, which was pretty cool, is that you could simply replace the motor. Well, everything is open. Replace the belt and connect the declination axis cable, and then just like run it, and you can see whether it's binding or not. So you'll want to actually run it and put it through a whole 180 degrees. So let's do that. So this is actually not quite possible with the RA axis because of the way that it's built. So it's something that works well for the declination axis. For the RA axis, you have to go a bit deeper, like it's a bit more painful to actually do. You kind of have to reassemble, test the binding, and then disassemble. So the binding, by the way, can occur on any place on the rotation angle. The reason for that is that the the gear itself might be slightly asymmetrical, or the shaft might be slightly asymmetrical. There could be a small asymmetry, which means that at some point you could actually be binding, whether at others you're not binding. And in my case, there are places on the rotation axis where it seems to be binding more easily than, be careful, than other places. Okay, so let's put back the timing belt. Okay, so I just like insert the timing belt well here, and you can see that once I tighten the screws, I'll have like the proper tension on the belt, which is good. So I take one screw, and I don't tighten it fully yet. Okay, so I keep it loose for the moment. And then the second screw that's in here. And I don't tighten it fully yet. And what I'll do is I'll just like make sure that, you know, there is a bit of like up and down kind of movement that can be done. So I want to make sure I'm like more or less in the middle and that I'm pulling back so that I get equal belt tension at the top and at the bottom of the belt. At least that's what I've been doing. And then once I'm done, I can just, while I am pulling on the motor, tighten this. And I'll tighten both screws. And then before I even reassemble, I can double check. I can connect the declination cable. And I'll turn on the mount. Initializing EQ mode, and I'll, you know, basically turn the whole axis 360 degrees to check whether there is any point where I am binding, because now I have found the point where I don't have any backlash anymore. Do I bind anywhere on that 360 degrees rotation? And I didn't get any binding, so we are good. We don't have binding, we don't have backlash, or any play at least that we can get, that we can feel. So we're pretty much ready to close the cover. Now I will mention something else, is that especially for the RA axis, remember those 4 screws that we loosened in order to use this this pull and those 2 push screws? In the RA axis in particular, when the screws are even slightly loose, doing that with the RA axis, yeah, I should tighten those bolts more. But anyway, doing that with the RA axis would actually make it make the worm itself kind of like push against those bolts. So I couldn't really tell, and so it appears like backlash, but it doesn't, it's not backlash caused by the worm and the gear not being properly meshed. It's backlash caused by the worm assembly kind of floating and being able to move. And so it was quite hard for me to determine where there was, like at what point there was backlash without completely tightening those 4 screws to keep everything in place and see, you know, what was happening. Another method is simply, I ended up getting a feel of how hard I need to turn this particular wheel here, and for it, 1, there be no backlash, and 2, there be no binding at the same time. So I like got a feel for like the strength I needed to put in that turn. But otherwise, it worked quite well. And so here we are, we have adjusted our backlash, so the only thing that's left to us is to just screw that cover back in. So I'm going to turn off the mount, and we can just screw this back in. And here we are, we're done. We've adjusted the backlash on our declination axis. It works pretty much in the same way for the RA axis. The only problem is those connectors are, you have like 2 encoders that you need to remove the connectors from, and then you remove the motor, and then you can actually take off the whole cover and put it down. But otherwise it's exactly the same principle. And that's pretty much it for this video, so I hope it was useful. And with that, I really got good performance from the mount. So actually yesterday early evening, or like more like at around 11 p.m. I was able to polar align the mounts using sharp cap, because there is no polar align scope in here. And once I had polar aligned the mount, I was able, with a simple camera lens, I just put it to guiding, I don't remember, somewhere in the northwestern sky fairly high in altitude. And the guiding calibration went very well. The guider actually got like 0.6 arc seconds RMS at that point, and then I put my Newtonian on top, which is like more than 10 kilograms of equipment, which is far more than this mount for imaging should be able to support. And with the Newtonian on, I got roughly 0.9 to 1 arc seconds RMS when there was no wind, but as soon as there was gusts of wind, that would like really spike. So this thing is very sensitive to wind, and I think that RA wiggle is like the one to blame for that. I also did some planetary astrophotography while I was doing while I was at it, because through the clouds break on towards the southeast, there was Jupiter, there was Saturn, there was the moon, and so I took a couple of pictures of Jupiter and Saturn through my C9.25. And you know, it was a bit wobbly. It did, like when changing the focus, or when, you know, I felt like the wobbliness, but this is perfectly normal for a mount this size. It was, I don't feel it was like any more than what I got from my AZ Mount Pro, and I used it both in equatorial mount and in alt-az mount, and with alt-az mode, and with the tuning it works much better. So I hope this video was useful. I hope you learned how to tune the backlash on your AZEQ5 GT mount. Please let me know down in the comments if I made any mistakes, or if there are things that I said that are wrong, because I am not mechanically inclined at all. It just worked for me. Your mileage may vary. Take care, don't break anything. This will void your warranty, although it, you know, nothing that you do is actually visible. No one would tell that you voided your warranty unless you like put a huge mark on the worm assembly, for example. But otherwise, yeah, be careful. And thank you so much for watching. If you are not subscribed to this channel, please consider subscribing. There's tons of videos. Recently, I talk a lot about this AZEQ5, but I have tons of other videos about polar alignment, about camera sensors, about gain offsets, about exposure times, about imaging nights, about solar imaging, about mounts, about all sorts of stuff. So if that sounds like something that interests you, feel free to go down, click on the subscribe button, click on that little notification bell. And if you like this video, please click on the like button, leave a comment down below, again, to correct me if I'm wrong about something. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Whenever you can, don't forget to look up at the stars, and I'll see you next time.